We talked last week about the report that revealed the extent, or at least to some degree, the extent of the bias in BBC's reporting on the war in Israel. The report covered the first 4 months from October 7th, and yeah, we had a lot to say about it. We have a lot more to say about it, and specifically about Jeremy Bowen, the international editor in the BBC, the guy who if not fully sets the tone, certainly, plays a big role in that. And if you look at his statements, he is not just following orders here. He is very much behind what he and his organization are doing. So yeah, we're gonna read an article about Jeremy Bowen. Welcome to the reality show, or as we should probably rename it, the talking about BBC bias show. It's not a great name. It's not very catchy. But yeah, this is the third of four episodes in a row of the reality show that we talk about this topic. But yeah, it's an important one. I'm joined by Michael, Marco, and Richard. Should we jump straight into the article, or does anybody have any quick opening comments?
I could just mention the fact that the report itself is a whole 199 pages of detail about how the BBC is biased on the issue of Israel. And this is a report that is, because it's been independently done, not run by the BBC, it hasn't been suppressed. So we're able to read it all, which means that we've been able to pick out a few quotes from it. And of course, it uses a lot of analysis. So as we mentioned on previous shows with AI, etc., to really drill down into it and to emphasize the point, which is completely obvious to anybody who watches the BBC output. This is. This is just further information and detail that backs up that point.
Yeah. Yeah, and we hear Jeremy Bowen. It's an understandable mistake to make. Express in his own words what he thinks about the BBC's policy, which I think says it all. Okay, so the article is titled "Jeremy Bowen Dismisses Report That Says BBC, quote, breached guidelines 1,500 times over Israel-Hamas war." Jeremy Bowen has dismissed a report that found the BBC breached its own editorial guidelines more than 1,500 times at the height of the Israel-Hamas war. The BBC's international editor labeled the Asserson report a, quote, deeply flawed document, and after it concluded the corporation's coverage was deeply biased against Israel. The research, which analyzed 4 months of output, accused Bowen of excusing Hamas terror activities and comparing Israel to Putin's Russia. Okay, maybe this is a good place to pause. Richard, can you give us basically the Cliff's Notes of what guidelines are we talking about? Because again, certainly for our American viewers, yeah, you have PBS and NPR and all that, but generally when you watch the news, it is some organization that is it's private. They can take whatever side they want, and it's completely up to them. And they don't have to answer to anybody, and you can change the channel if you don't like it.
Yeah, I mean the BBC is supposed to be completely impartial. It's supposed to have this charter which allows it to educate and inform. By educate, I think they seem to interpret that as activate or use activism. Activism education is the same thing all over the place, isn't it? And the BBC sees it as the same thing. So that's quite apparent. I mean, on this point that you just raised about comparisons with Russia, I've got a quote from Jeremy Bowen on that. And I should just mention that this report, it's got 199 pages. And I think Jeremy Bowen is the most referenced person in the report. He must have at least 24 references to him specifically in the report. Now, bear in mind, he's one of the most senior journalists at the BBC. He's been there for decades with a focus on the Middle East. It's no surprise. But in this relation to this Russia point, I thought I'd just read this one out just to give some meat on the bone. So this is from the report, and it's a quote from Jeremy Bowen that the report uses to refer to it. This is what Jeremy Bowen said in one of his reports. He said, some of the Palestinian dead would have been, can you raise it slightly? Just can't quite see it. Some of the Palestinian dead would have been part of Hamas. But even if that proportion is as high as 10%, which is unlikely, it means that Israel is on course to have killed as many Palestinian civilians in just over a month as Russia has killed in Ukraine since February 2022. This is Jeremy Bowen recrafting the narrative in order to compare with Russia and Ukraine for a set purpose. That purpose is quite clear, to make Israel look like the enemy.
Marco?
Yeah, this report was done using AI to analyze over 9 million words, which have been spewed out by the BBC, either via articles, podcasts, or certain reports on the news. And the AI effectively checked what is called a sympathy analysis, which is how emotive words related to how people feel about something, like happiness, sadness, all this kind of stuff, are used in reporting. And this is exactly how the pattern was detected by the AI, in the sense that every effectively shows how the bias is and where it appears, where it's noticeable, even though you don't realize what you're reading. For example, the analysis of the language allows you to understand if you're giving a positive slant to something or a negative slant to something else. For example, it makes the point that when you refer to the people killed in Israel versus the children and the families killed in Gaza, automatically referring to something as emotional as families, children, toddlers, babies, all this kind of stuff, which is referred to Gaza, is designed. The use of the language is designed on purpose to make you feel more automatically feeling in favor of Gaza, feeling that the deaths in Gaza are more important and therefore even feel bigger than the losses on following October 7th. So October 7th, you had dead people who died versus the retaliation, which was babies and toddlers and families, all this kind of stuff. So that's how the report is flawed. Although reading out of context, you wouldn't actually realize what it is. If you start analyzing under the point of view, you realize how the bias is done. And it's not an accident, it's done on purpose.
Yeah, and even Richard, you mentioned that he said in that quote, he said something like, even if 10% were Hamas, which is unlikely, as if it's likely to be lower. According to like who are you basing that on? Because the IDF has tells a different story, but of course, when it's the IDF, you're not supposed to believe them. When it's Hamas, the people who committed the atrocities, the people who say all we want to do is exterminate the Jews, and the people who admit that they're hiding behind their own civilians. That those are the people you rely on, and even in that case, he seemed to do the Lancet thing of saying, "Look, Hamas is underestimating the numbers." Michael, I always mention to you, you luckily don't have to consume the BBC or the Guardian whenever we talk about one of these. But then I remember you consume American or Israeli media, which is not as good, but doesn't also have this this whole structure of the BBC, which is funded by force, and the justification for it is it's going to be impartial, and so on. So yeah, your thoughts.
Yeah, a few things. If you could, one quick background addition. Correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but this is the third or fourth report that's come out now, I think, that the BBC is anti-Israel. It's been going on. It looked like from what I was able to read, about 2004 it started, at least in modern times, and it's happened in at least 2004, I think 2006 and 21, and then in 2021 again before this all started, and then of course now. So this is nothing new. I think that's point one. I think one thing, if it's any comfort to you in the UK, PBS has come under increasing scrutiny because they are a publicly funded broadcasting system that is taxpayer money. So we don't get a separate bill for PBS, but we get It's taxpayer money, and it's extremely clear, and they're quite proud of it, that they have a socialist slash semi-communist agenda that is basically, you know, all the ills of the world are from corporate America, and none of the good in the world is from corporate America. And by the way, it's always corporate America. It's never anybody else's corporations, because we know Chinese auto plants don't pollute, for example. But that's probably a little unfair, but they are extremely anti-corporate America. They are always pointing out the problems. And if you listened to them 10 years ago, you would have thought the world was going to end in 2015 or 2017 or 2018. Of course, we're still around. So we do share some of this problem that you all have. I think we have to put up with this stuff for reasons that are unclear. The word obfuscation came to mind when I was reading the response to this report. I mean, this report was done by a bunch of computers that are, you know, the only thing pretty much able to handle 9 million or whatever the data inputs number of words were. There's no other way to do this. So there was nothing biased about that. Nobody programmed. I'm sure if they ran this report again, or somebody else ran it, it would be fine. So what Jeremy had to do was to obfuscate, which is to mean, you know, make it all very incomprehensible, and we're not sure about this analysis, and it was flawed because it was AI, which is an interesting point, because the only other option would be to human intelligence, in which case it would have been more flawed. But let them say that, because this is part of their obfuscation, and to make it all cloudy. The fact that there was zero introspection shouldn't surprise anybody. You have the Harvard president who had to resign, who never really apologized. And God knows she's still teaching the same crap in her courses at Harvard, because of course she's still a full professor there. But one of the things you learn from politicians is you never admit that you are wrong, and never go look deeply into what you're doing. What I think we need to go back to, and I know we need to get into the details, and we should today, but really you have to ask yourselves, what could be the possible motivation of a Western media outfit for supporting what is clearly a terrorist organization? What could be? Just, you know, we had it when CNN reported. I saw a CNN headline when the 6 hostages were killed. They were not listed as killed by CNN. 6 hostages were returned to Israel dead. They weren't returned to Israel. Israel went in there and got 6 hostages that were recently killed after being put in deplorable conditions, which everybody loves to talk about international law, which of course violates every bit of international law, blah, blah, blah. Never mind that these were non-combatants for the most part. And of course, there was an American-Israeli hostages, and you know that our amazing administration here in the US didn't really care, because that's okay. American lives don't matter. It's everybody else's life that matters. So it's all over the place, and I think you have to believe it. You doing it a few times is one thing. Doing it 1,500 times, which is what this article came out with, it's clearly anti-Semitism, and frankly it's anti-Western. And we need to call it that. We need to stop pussyfooting around and stop saying that this is just a mistake or a bias. This isn't bias. This is a systematic goal to destroy Jewish people, and frankly, to destroy Western civilization in favor of not another civilization. Because what Iran stands for, and all of its tentacles stand for, is not civilization, it's barbarism. And that's what these media elites want to support, and that's what they are doing everything they can to do.
Paul says, Caroline Glick interviewed the guy who was responsible for the report and said there is a lot more to come. We will keep an eye, and there will probably be a lot more to come here on the channel as well. Yeah, Michael, you mentioned that he criticized the report. Yeah, he criticized the report, and basically at the same time explains why the policies that the report is criticizing him for are right. So I don't know why he criticized the report. And yeah, you mentioned that PBS is funded directly through your taxes, whereas here it's a kind of it's a separate thing. You have to pay a TV license. It's a separate tax. I prefer this system. I prefer not to pay for any of these channels at all. But
Yeah.
I do prefer generally, if taxes, any type of taxes are not taken, the money that ends up in your bank account isn't after taxes have been taken, but it's your full amount, and then you get these letters saying that we're taking, or sorry, we're not taking, but you are requested to pay this amount of money or else, because that really concretizes it for people a lot more, which is why there is some opposition in this country to the TV license, whereas there's not much opposition to taxes in general and how they're used. So anyway, back to the article. So where were we? Okay, but during a BBC masterclass event on, quote, reporting war impartially on Friday, the 64-year-old took issue with its findings. In a recording obtained by the Telegraph, Bowen said, quote, "It's a deeply flawed document, in my opinion. The Asserson report is a report that has been put together essentially saying we are anti-Semitic. Isn't that right?" David Jordan, the BBC's director of editorial policy and standards, could then be heard correcting him, saying, quote, "It's basically saying we're biased against Israel. This is going through the BBC's complaint process at the moment, so we're probably best not to say anything about it." Bowen replied, "What I say, it's about the truth. We're in the truth business. If we cannot tell the truth, something has gone very badly wrong and we have failed in our objectives. So I will always try to tell the truth, but sometimes the truth is complicated. It's not on the one hand, and on the other hand, the truth lies somewhere in between. No, actually, it's sometimes the truth lies on one hand and you have to say it. And I think that searching for some kind of spurious balance is entirely wrong. So this is, by the way, if people think I, go over the top with the titles of episodes, maybe sometimes I do, but this was what got me to title this episode. He's the way we did. He's not even hiding it. He's not saying we're not taking a side. He's saying we're right to take a side. The truth is on one side here, and the side that he has taken is, again, the side, listen to Hamas in their own words. They're not talking about, we want peace, but we're living under occupation and, we have no choice but to resist. They're saying we want to exterminate the Jews. They're saying there is not going to be any Israel when we're done. And he is saying this is where the truth lies. So yes, he is, he can criticize a report, but again, that report is saying what he is saying about himself. Richard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the point here is that there's no evidence for required for these people like Jeremy Bowen. So you simply assert a fact, and it becomes a fact because you assert it. So you assert that Israel is in the wrong, and then, of course, later on, you assert that this report is deeply flawed. It's the same principle. You just decide what you like and what you don't like, and claim that's the full story and the truth. I think one of the criticisms of the AI is actually completely wrong in the fact that the AI allows you to pull out the raw quotes from so much material, so you can actually use the words of a particular report, and in this case, a particular journalist, as your evidence. So instead of, humans inconceivably watching 9 million hours or whatever equivalent 9 million words is in watch time in order to pull out all the quotes, AI can allow you to get straight to those quotes. Which is why they've been able to pull out so many examples to back up, the point here, and particularly the point in relation to Jeremy Bowen. They talk about it within the report, how many times they use the fact many people say that. It's a phrase he uses repeatedly within his news reports. Again, for that exact same reason I mentioned at the start, to assert a fact. You don't state that this is your personal opinion. You claim that many people, completely unsourced, think that, and therefore that's not to be questioned. And that just asserts a fact as it is. So that's all in it. And I think one of the things that the BBC is particularly keen to do is always to put the best gloss on the side of an argument it likes, and endlessly denigrate the side that it doesn't. For example, there's a scandal going around at the moment to do with the government, where, you know, who paid for the clothing of the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's wife. And at the moment, you know, 2 months into a new government, BBC, a government that the BBC quite likes because it's the Labour Party, and they're the ones most likely to renew the BBC's charter, most likely to increase the license fee, ensure their you know their nests are well feathered, let's say. And what's the BBC doing at the moment? It's doing a report on all the world leaders of the world, and how it's not always the taxpayer, you know, it's the taxpayer that often funds their clothing. So it's, you know, it's only fair that the Prime Minister and his wife haven't paid for their own suits and spectacles to the tune of £76,000 because you know, lots of other countries do it that way. So you know, it's only fair. Whereas were this a Tory government, were this time last year, there's no way that report would be covered in the same way. So it's not just Israel that they do this on. They do this on areas where they've got a definite preference for a certain argument, and they choose to distort their coverage to reflect it.
And to stress on that particular point about the clothing paid by some individual for the Prime Minister, our Foreign Office guy, David Lammy, actually said, in order to justify the fact that Starmer was given free clothing, it effectively said that there is a special fund, taxpayer fund, for the First Lady. And the BBC was quite careful not to come up with a fact check, because that's not true. So, you know, our Foreign Office guy tells a massive whopper, a lie, which everybody else gets fact checked, and you know, it would be slammed in big character as a liar by the BBC. But again, you know, the BBC, what is the BBC? It's not like society. It's not an entity. It's made up of lots of little lefty Marxists who bring to the office their own ideology. And part of their ideology is to believe their own truth, their own reality, and the stuff they want to push. The fact that the charter for the BBC includes educating people, I mean, how terrible is that? Effectively, you have the power, you've been given by the state the power to educate, shape minds, and all this kind of stuff, which they relish. They absolutely love it, because they can say what they want and get away with it. And by the fact that they say, somebody else would pick it up, because, you know, riding on the BBC's prestige, they actually can say what they want, and that becomes a fact, and people pick it up, and you find this kind of statement in reports appearing over and over again. But even calling the report deeply flawed is a tried and tested method that civil servants use all the time. You just cast some doubt, without mentioning it was flawed, which part of it, which bit of the methodology you don't like or you find dodgy. You just say deeply flawed. It's enough to put some smear on the thing and make people believe perhaps this is not as reliable as we thought. And then the fact that he was talking within a workshop for reporting war impartially, that in itself betrays the fact that the rules of impartiality within the BBC are not followed. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to have a workshop to tell people how to report war in an impartial way, because that should be the very DNA of the BBC, being objective, and they're not being like that. And again, this Bowen guy is not a junior journalist. For at least 3 decades, has been chief correspondent for the Middle East. So the guy who relies information with the highest status comes from him for the BBC. So he says something and becomes the official line of the BBC. And as I said earlier on, is then picked up by smaller outfits, and it's, you know, broadcasted around the world. And he is pushing again the two-state solution, the very solution that in the last 80 years hasn't worked. So what kind of correspondent are you if you can't realize that the position you're pushing doesn't work? Aren't you intellectually curious and wonder why is not this working? Why has it been 80 years and if we still can have a two-state solution? Because if you look into it, you will realize that the Arabs are always the ones that turn it down, are always the ones that are on the side of having just one state, and that's destruction of Israel, and they just want to be caliphate. You know, if you really were interested in being objective, you would see the kind of stuff straight away.
Michael.
Remember that there are educated, I won't say smart, because I think we've realized that there's a dissociation between real brains and thought and getting educated, especially since education has gone the way it has in the humanities and history. But remember, there's a group of people that truly believes that communism will work. It just needs another chance. Another chance, because not enough people died under Stalin, and not enough people have been killed under the Chinese and Khmer Rouge and so on and so forth. Millions and millions and millions of people are dead because the misery had to be distributed equally. And the only people living well were the people in charge. And this is the same kind of, I guess it's theocracy. I guess it's a new kind of religion where people like him believe that if you just keep saying something, it will somehow become true. You cannot have a two-state solution when one of the states has called for the annihilation of the other state, period. Full stop, end of story. Stop the discussion and remove the people who want to annihilate the other party. Otherwise, there's no two-state solution. One wonders what these people would have said when Hitler was trying to take over Britain. Don't you? Because surely it was okay what he did, what Hitler did. And really, the fact that America and Britain joined together, along with, you know, a little bit of piece of France that was left, and came back, and with Russia's help, you know, ironically, and came back and finally took out Germany and took it out. And finally, the Americans dropped atomic bombs on Japan because that's what it took to get people to stop flying their aircraft into American vessels. You know, what would this guy say? Now, many people have written about this, and if kids ever learn George Orwell, or Ayn Rand for that matter, but if you don't like Ayn Rand, look at George Orwell with Animal Farm. Being ruled by other people who think they know better. They don't know better. They've just got power. They've kissed someone's butt better than you did. And that's what this gentleman is talking about. First of all, he uses obfuscation, as we talked about. The other word that Orwell coined, which is beautiful, is doublespeak. Because people can tell you that the ground is up and the sky is down. And if they keep saying it with authority, eventually there's a lot of people that believe them. Just like this guy can say that's an analysis, by the way, the fourth report, best as I could tell, the fourth report that said the BBC is biased, this fourth report, which was carried out in a way completely unique to any of the other past three reports, which effectively came to the same thing, only did it with human intelligence. This one did it with artificial intelligence programmed by a robot, just counted. And it came out with the fact that the BBC, and they do it all the time. We've talked about it on the show a lot. So my point is that unless there's somebody who's going to have oversight over the BBC and actually look at this stuff, it's all going to go into what in America we would call the congressional review committees, you know, and it's a black box. And, you know, maybe in 5 years, something will come out quietly and it'll be some redacted report and so on. But this institution that you guys are talking about is absolutely corrupt. They are funded with no question, effectively with no, as you said, they're with no questions asked. And of course, they're happy with the current government. They're in bed with the current government. So their policies are the same as the current government. And they will continue that direction until somebody stops it.
Yeah, and you know, when criticizing this report, like the report gives numbers. It's very specific. You know, it says, look, you accused Israel of committing genocide 14 times more than you said that the Palestinians are doing that, where the Palestinians are saying that that is what they want. So that kind of says something about you know how accurate the BBC's reporting is. But yeah, it's easier to say generally we reject this But look, much like the BBC, much of what we talk about on this channel deserves both judgment and mockery, which is why we have from time to time the Ayn Rand Center UK mock trials. And right after this show, in 30 minutes, we have another mock trial. James Valiant, former state prosecutor in California, Matthew Humphreys, current criminal defense attorney in London, and I will be playing the villain, a completely fictional character, not based on anybody who can sue us. The character of a professor who protested against Israeli apartheid and genocide back in May. That professor, their official job title is Secretary General of the Philosophy Department at Columbia University. So I encourage members at the platinum level and higher, and at the inner circle level, YouTube members to tune in an hour. That's going to be fun. Megan Ribbons is going to be playing the police officer. Yeah, and if you are not yet a member at that level, you can sign up right now or at any time in the next 27 minutes or later on, and you can access it later. All right, back to the article. Okay, so Greg Smith, the Tory MP for Buckingham, accused Mr. Bowen of an, quote, outrageous response. When in a hole, stop digging, he said. But the BBC seems to have brought the excavator in and are making the matter a whole lot worse. It seems it comes as MPs are set to pressure the BBC over an internal report on its coverage of Israel that has been quote, suppressed for almost 2 decades, ordered in 2004 following repeated complaints of bias by the Israeli government. It was carried out by Malcolm Bowen, a senior journalist. The Culture, Media and Sports Committee is expected to raise the issue with the broadcaster when Parliament returns next month amid mounting criticism of its Middle Eastern coverage. The Asserson report, which was led by Trevor Asserson, a British lawyer, has prompted fresh calls for the BBC to publish a separate internal inquiry known as the Bowen Report. Lord Polak, the honorary president of the Conservative Friends of Israel, branded the decision to withhold the report, quote, an example of mistrust. The Conservative peer, who has previously called for the findings to be published, told the Telegraph, quote, everything these days is about transparency and freedom of information. What is it they're hiding in it? Don't be mysterious. By being mysterious, it allows people to form their own conclusions. If they want to just explain things, let us know what it is they may be hiding. Gary Mond, the chairman of the National Jewish Assembly, added, quote, it is highly unfortunate that the findings of the Bowen report produced in 2004 have never been published in the 20 years that have elapsed since. This has begged the question that the BBC is trying to hide something. Quote, whatever those findings were, I do think that the BBC, as a provider of a major public service, has a responsibility to share the report and its conclusions with everyone. The National Jewish Assembly therefore calls for this to happen. Lord Austin, a crossbench peer, said, quote, the findings of the Asserson report are only the latest evidence of the BBC's long-standing and deep-lying bias in its coverage of Israel. Quote, Jeremy Bowen seems unable to acknowledge these editorial failings. If Director General Tim Davie is serious in his pledge to consider a deep, systematic review of the BBC's Middle East coverage, Mr. Bowen's deeply concerning track record should be right at the top of the agenda. The BBC has said its internal inquiry was commissioned, quote, for the purposes of journalism, and so falls outside the scope of freedom of information laws. Danny Cohen, a former BBC executive, last week warned that there was an, quote, institutional crisis at the national broadcaster and called for an independent inquiry into its coverage of the Hamas war. Actually, you know what? I can keep reading the comments from everybody, but I do want to get to the BBC's comments. But look, some of these people are not right wing, let's say. And even when we talk about somebody who's from the Conservative Party was in power until a couple of months ago. They weren't exactly pro-Israel. So yeah, to have such criticism is good. It's interesting that none of these people just say, look, this guy should not be running the BBC's international desk if he is so clearly biased and has been for decades. Richard.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, earlier Michael mentioned George Orwell and Animal Farm, and of course you mentioned your forthcoming acting role in the mock trial. Well, it just the two combined together remind me that at school we put on a production of Animal Farm, and I played Benjamin, the cynical donkey that tries to warn the rest of the barnyard where all of this is heading. So not much has changed. Now, the one of the things that you need to do in order to do that is to focus on the emissions. And one of the things this report is really good at is focusing on all the emissions within the BBC's reporting that are necessary to produce a true and accurate picture of what's going on in this conflict. And of course, these are the things that will be super familiar to many of our viewers on this channel, because they're the kind of emissions that we choose to highlight a lot of the time because they're not covered elsewhere. But they include things like not referring to the Hamas's charter, for example, and what's in it, not referring to how much of a dictatorship Hamas is in terms of how it's run Gaza up until now, and what the freedom, what life is like for gay people or women, etc. there. It includes the journalistic freedom that is restricted for people reporting within Gaza, and therefore a lot of the reports that come from Gaza are either from Hamas journalists who are sometimes also hostage holders, and the like, and the lack of being able to provide non-biased reporting from there. That doesn't excuse what Jeremy Bowen does, but by any means. It covers things like the use of the word terrorist when it comes to Hamas, with the BBC's strong reluctance to do that, and of course things like the military threats to Israel, which they choose to avoid a lot of the time. The true details of what the ordeal that the hostages go through, that's often belittled in many of these reports, and of course a lot of the social economic cost that occurs to Israel is never featured within this. I think one example I wanted to focus on when it comes to Jeremy Bowen was the Al-Ali hospital, because that one has a particular, it just sets it up so perfectly. I mean, we know this occurred right near the beginning of the conflict, and the BBC never apologizes. Jeremy Bowen certainly never apologizes. So this is what happened when in relation to the Al-Ali hospital. So this is a direct quote from the report. The BBC, by contrast, has never written an adequate apology or correction. BBC Verify, that's the BBC fact check system called BBC Verify, which is, I don't think is highly selective and rarely right, attempted to conduct an in-depth analysis. However, despite this claiming to be a highly specialized operation, it drew no conclusions or improved understanding of the situation. Now, what was the bit I wanted to skip to? So this is what Jeremy Bowen said in the course of that report, reporting after the hospital attack. He said, "It is hard to see what else this could be, given the size of the explosion, other than an Israeli airstrike or several airstrikes." And then when the story came out, the truth of the story, that it was Hamas and that it was their own explosion within the car park, etc., this is what the report says. Jeremy Bowen refused to apologize for the error, stating, quote, "I don't regret a single thing in my report, because I think I measured all the way. I don't feel bad at all," unquote. So if you're caught out, you just say I wasn't wrong.
And if you think that the omissions are bad enough, just read the report and see what the actual guy said. In one of the statements he made in one of the, I don't know whether it was a podcast or during a news report, he effectively justified the use of Hamas, of schools and hospitals, in order to run bases against Israel, because his argument is that, well, poor Hamas is such a disadvantage militarily against Israel that they're justified to use this kind of whatever they can put their hands on, which is the kind of mentality that makes you wonder: are you what are you awake when you say these things, or are you just rotten to the core? Because you cannot be, as Michael pointed out, on the side of Hamas. Somebody like him, who's supposed to be an expert, somebody gets the news day in, day out, and focuses on the kind of area and those kind of conflicts. Somebody who doesn't actually see what's going on. Is that possible that you never realize what Hamas is and what it does, and therefore you forget to mention what it is? These people hate. These people hate the BBC, hate Britain, hate whatever any institution funded by taxpayers stand for, and they just use it to their own advantage. They don't care about truth. They don't care about humanitarian aid. They don't care about humans. They don't care about anyone apart from pushing their own narrative, apart from making sure that whatever is good in the West is destroyed and whatever looks good is actually presented as bad, because they are anti-life. The way they keep pushing these people that insist in the destruction of Israel, the only democratic state in the Middle East, the only place where Arab people can actually have a democracy, have a say, recognize the facts. But no, they choose not to. They choose to look the other way, and they choose to marry themselves to the cause of the monsters who did and create and will and has promised that will do October 7 over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, that quote, Richard, that you read from Jeremy Bowen, look, humans are fallible, mistakes are possible, but if you make a mistake of that size of accusing people who don't do this, even when it's necessary, would not bomb a hospital, to report that, see the results of the reporting, which was violent protests around the world that night. To basically know that reporting something like this, which is why this was such an important thing for Hamas, that their useful idiots in the West repeat this at this time, 10 days after the attack, to help shift a shift that was already happening to make it clear that Israel is now the bad guy because they're no longer dying. They're actually trying to prevent more Israelis from dying. That is so evil that it really tells you who this person is. It also tells you, if he says he doesn't regret it, and then he says that what matters is the truth. It tells you that for him, the truth is whatever needs to be said in order to push the agenda. And I think he understands that the agenda is exterminating the Jews. He is not if there are any people in the world who actually are innocently thinking a two-state solution of Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security, he is not one of those people. He is one of the people who know that it is Palestine instead of Israel and all the people living there. Michael.
Well, one of the other ironies that comes out when the journalists start supporting terrorists, just like when the journalists support communists, and they, when was it Trotsky, I think, took over, based on Leninism, took over Russia, and then it escalated beautifully to Stalin, which was sort of the ultimate, and then started to taper. Was the first people they kill after they're done killing the LGBTQ people is to kill the journalists. I mean, a non-free press is absolutely a sine qua non of a totalitarian regime. So just to show you how sick these people are, and by the way, they're just as sick as the useful idiots, including especially the LGBTQ people who are out there screaming, globalize the intifada, death to Israel, death to America. Let's all be like Iran, and let's be like Gaza, and let's be like Hezbollah. And you people are going to be the first people pushed off the roof or in front of the firing squad. And yet that's how corrupt this all is. And the journalists are the first that when people take over society and make it totalitarian, they destroy the free press. It's in the protocol. It's in the recipe book. So you talk about evil, and this is what I find so frustrating to me is I have tried, and I've been talking, we've been on this show for many months. I haven't heard a single argument honestly, that has anything positive to say about Hamas or Gaza. There just doesn't seem to be any justification. I think the last estimate I read was $16 billion in aid have gone into Hamas, and we all see where it went. Because what they have is they have a tunnel system which is bigger than the UK Underground, the London Underground. And with that kind of money in that kind of an area, they could have created an amazing Mecca and had a tourist destination. Their beaches are some of the nicest in all of this area of the Middle East. They're actually nicer than most of the beaches in Tel Aviv and the southern parts of Israel. But they chose to build tunnels, and they chose to import weapons and other destructive things in through Egypt, because that's where it all came in, through the Philadelphia corridor. And that's what they chose to do. They didn't take care of their people. They didn't create schools. Lord knows they don't want to educate women. And there are by far the majority of people that are pro-Hamas are women. Another astonishing fact that just shows you how utterly ignorant and possibly evil, because you're either stupid or you're malicious, one of the two. These people all are. And it starts with the media elite, because they know better. They all know better. And anybody who has half a brain, who sits around and thinks these people don't sit there and collude with each other and figure out how they're going to pitch everything and spin everything and leave out words, and every single word is chosen very carefully, are really ignorant. And you really have too much faith in these folks. These people are evil people. What's ironic is when somebody supports their own destruction, you have to run away from them. They're no longer allowed to have your listening and your time and your brain power. And this is a big problem in our society, starting, I think, with Obama, who decided that all countries are basically good and evil to the same extent. America's not perfect, therefore everybody's okay. And we need to apologize for being successful, and so on and so forth. Therefore, any position is acceptable, and it isn't. Positions that absolutely contradict life, including your own, especially your own, need to be shunned. You need to run away from those people as quickly as possible. You need to get away. People who want their own destruction, you can run this story out and see where it's leading, need to be shunned. And Jeremy needs to be shunned. And frankly, the BBC is increasingly needs to be shunned. Look, Harvard has lost enormous credibility. It will not generally be called an elite university anymore. If it is, it's put in quotes. And it's only elite because it's elitist, with a DEI program, which we all know hasn't worked. And the BBC will lose its elite status. It's just a matter of time. And yet the people running the BBC somehow think that this method and this protocol is going to be successful. Crazy.
Well, I hope you're right about just being a matter of time until people realize what the BBC is. I'm not sure I'm as optimistic. I do completely agree with you. People who take the Palestinian side are either stupid or evil. And in the case of the BBC, it's not the former.
Yes.
They're very well aware of what they're doing. Here is the BBC's response in the article. The BBC last week strongly rejected claims in the Asserson report that its staff, quote, celebrated acts of terror. It said in a statement, "We strongly reject the attack on individual members of BBC staff, all of whom are working to the same editorial guideline." It'd be nice if they also rejected attacks, against Jews. But anyway, I'll continue their response. The corporation also raised, quote, serious questions about the methodology of the report, which used artificial intelligence to analyze 9 million words of its coverage. Stressing it was required to achieve, quote, due impartiality. The BBC said that this was already being achieved by its correspondents in lieu of the, quote, balance of sympathy the report wanted. A BBC spokesman said, quote, "We have serious questions about the methodology of this report, particularly its heavy reliance on AI to analyze impartiality and its interpretation of the BBC's editorial guidelines. We don't think coverage can be assessed solely by counting particular words divorced from context. We are required to achieve due impartiality rather than the, quote, balance of sympathy proposed in the report, and we believe our knowledgeable and dedicated correspondents are achieving this despite the highly complex, challenging, and polarizing nature of the conflict. However, we will consider the report carefully and respond directly to the authors once we have had time to study it in detail. The most recent research shows that audiences are significantly more likely to turn to the BBC for impartial coverage than to any other provider. Independent research from More in Common found that the highest portion of people thought BBC coverage of this story was mostly neutral. Richard.
Okay, I've got another quote from Jeremy Bowen to see whether you agree with how it fits in with what Razi's just read there. So here's what Jeremy Bowen said in one particular report. He said, quote, "The essence of asymmetric warfare, the weak against the strong, a small organization like Hamas against a great big standing army like Israel's, is that they have to leverage the things that they can leverage in terms of trying to get an edge," unquote. That's a quote from him explaining why Hamas use schools and hospitals as command centers. I mean, it just makes your eyeballs pop out of your head when you read these for yourself. And I encourage people to look at the full report and have a look for yourself, because there is so many quotes that you could you could use from this. But the fact that I mean, we've mentioned it in many of the shows that we've done in the course of the coverage of this war, is about the fact that Hamas is presented as an underdog, and that Israel as the the big player in this. And that's the framing for the whole look at it, and therefore you always support the underdog, even if the underdog is made up of barbarians trying to murder on a genocidal aim. That plays no part in it. Who's big? Who's small? Who's weak? Who's strong? Those are the simplistic ways in which they look at it and in which they frame everything, and that kind of justification for using hospitals and schools comes out. And of course, that when they're reporting on a bomb hitting a hospital or a school, it's a completely different story. And there'll be no reference to the fact that Hamas uses command centers in those instances.
Yeah, again, it's not about reporting the fact. It's about making sure that they are the elite and that we all have to listen to what they say, and we don't have to question their view of the world. So the fact that they are pushing Hamas as the good side, it's not to be questioned. That's the kind of direction we should go. Whether it's because they have a rotten view of humans, effectively, that humans have to be enslaved, and they must be among the elite that tells humans how to behave, because humans are so stupid they cannot work out their own life. Freedom is terrible, because would move people away from their control. But as long as you make people believe and kneel in front of a god, a nature, or society, that's good for them, because they're going to be those in power. They're going to be those that tell you how to behave, what you can do or you cannot do. And that's what they're doing. They're trying to effectively shape people's brain, making people believe that the way they tell is the way it is. But again, you cannot look at Hamas and realize that the people who take hostages, the people who build tunnels, the people who take the hostages and keep them in tunnels are going to triumph in the end, because it's quite obvious where the bad side is. And despite how twisted you are, how ignorant, or how much you indulge in evasion, that's the truth, and it will come through. So you might like to ignore the facts and report on the side of Hamas, but anyone with a bit of brain will see that, and you cannot stop people with a bit of brain to actually see what the truth is.
Michael.
Yeah, you could start every report with following the massacre of 1,300 Israelis and the taking of 200 plus hostages and so on, including the numerous missiles. We all forget about the missiles before October 7th. Hamas was regularly shooting missiles. And by the way, killing plenty of Palestinians in the process, because these missiles are low quality and nobody gives a damn when you're shooting from civilian areas. Civilians get killed. They could start everything that way. They could have equalized a lot of the language. The comments that they make are wrong. One of the biggest problems, though, is that it's a little like medicine, okay? And I'm a doctor, so I always use analogies here. People's hearts need to run, their lungs need to work, and their brain needs to function. Those are pretty much the three things you need to stay alive, at least for a reasonable amount of time. Of course, you need a liver and kidney and everything else to do stuff. But if your heart stops or your lung stops or your brain stops, you're pretty much gone. That's not that complicated. Now, medicine is very complicated, but the foundations of medicine are pretty simple. They're pretty straightforward. There are some foundational elements that need to occur for people to live. The same thing is true here. There's a lot of details. I watched one of the Corbyn interviews where he starts talking about the West Bank all of a sudden, because there's tunnels being built in the West Bank by Hamas and mostly Islamic Jihad, and probably the Palestinian authorities helping as well. And there's a lot of terrorist events, and there's Israelis being attacked and sometimes killed every day by people breaking out of the West Bank, which is, okay, I guess. It's okay to go and murder people if they're near the West Bank. And Israel has had to clamp down pretty hard. And there's all kinds of terrorist activity there. And now all of a sudden Jeremy's upset about all that stuff. Now Israel's committing, horrendous terrorist type crimes there. It's really not that complicated. The whole thing is not complicated. You have an ideology which is a barbaric 7th century ideology to annihilate everyone in the West, starting in the Middle East, because that's where they live, and branching out. Remember, America's the great Satan, Israel's the little one, and the UK is somewhere in the middle. And it goes from there. And it's really, the foundations of this problem are very simple. Now, there are Arab states who have decided to take a different path. We've talked about that, UAE, Bahrain, etc. Even Saudi Arabia let women start to drive recently by themselves, although I still think they need an escort. And I'm saying it cynically on purpose, because this is what we're talking about. But it's simple. And that's what everyone loves to believe, that these elites have some great knowledge of all this complicated stuff. And frankly, last point, the West was not built on complicated stuff. What grew out of it was complicated. The West was built on Western philosophy that basically is paraphrased in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in reason and purpose and self-esteem, and enabling people to flourish on their own, with the statement that the less government control you have, the better people will do for themselves. Let people do for themselves. And yes, you can build safety nets and so on, but the foundations are simple. And this is what has been lost in the great new humanities thinking of our time, that it's all very complicated and only a professor of Harvard or a BBC journalist will understand it. And I think that's what people need to stop believing. That's why people need to stop listening to these folks. And as you guys said, Marco and Richard, start thinking on your own and ask, does what they're saying make any sense? And be a simple person. Does it help my liberty? Or does it cause me to pay more taxes? I work and they get money. Doesn't sound right to me, and so on.
Well, if people start thinking for themselves, professors in the humanities will be out of a job. But since they're not yet out of a job, I will be playing one in the mock trial that begins right after this show ends. I'm already falling into character, so I'm going to quickly ask you guys, Marco, Richard, where can people find more of you?
Check out the Briefly Objective. We had a new video out on there on Friday, so you can check out that one. That's the links in the description below. That's for short content taken from this channel with added visuals to really drive home a point. So please like, subscribe, add it to your social media.
and
And
share.
Michael? Oh yeah, Marco, go ahead.
No, and also check out the Substack, ARCUK Substack.
Michael?
Beautiful. Much simpler. LinkedIn, Kaufman with 2 Fs.
And tomorrow, The Cutting Edge returns. I believe it's 8:30 UK time, 3:30 Eastern on its own channel, not this channel. Link will be in the description and maybe in the live chat, although we are going off the air, so you maybe won't catch it in time. But yeah, make sure you subscribe to the Cutting Edge channel. That is where the Cutting Edge will stream from now on. Harry Binswanger will be a guest on the first show. Thanks everybody for watching. Platinum members and above, Inner Circle members, mock trial begins in a couple minutes. See you there.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Daniel, please send me